So the MZ1 Wireless has been out for roughly a year now, and I wanted to make a bit of a different video on it since the time I pre-ordered it and have been using it ever since. Now just to get it out of the way, the MZ1 is in my top 3 favorite mice ever, coming into second place behind the Endgame Gear XM2WE. Now why I decided to make a video on this mouse of all is just to show off what changes I made to it to just suit my personal needs and to explain as to why I have it as my second spot. Initially I felt there was a fair bit that needed to be changed with the stock MZ1 Wireless. First off was the weight. Now the mouse was initially 62ish grams, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the issue with the weight was how dense the mouse felt because of it. It's a very narrow, flat and small mouse, so compacting all that it has to offer did leave me feeling a bit fatigued a fair bit, especially as I do play higher settings and for 90% of the time I use my wrist solely on games. Second was the excessive and bright RGB. The initial battery is really solid, being a 500 mAh capacity, which also added on to the weight. It did give around 75ish hours of use though, but drained heaps quicker when the RGB was on and at its brightest, and believe me, that thing was insanely bright. Third was the adjustable sensor cage, which also acted as a weight shift for the battery. I personally felt it was a bit gimmicky and just very unnecessary. Shifting into whichever position left the mouse feeling very off balance, mainly being front heavy. And even if you have the cage shifted all the way to the back, it would still have the feeling of more weight to the front. Fourth is going to be the scroll wheel. It leans to the heavier, more tactile side of things, where I initially thought the encoder might be a Japanese Alps, but turns out it's an OEM encoder called an F-switch brown with a pink core. Pairing that with the pretty mediocre scroll grip makes the overall experience a bit tough but still manageable. Fifth is going to be kind of just a two-parter, as they're things I technically couldn't physically change anything to accommodate to my liking. One is going to be the width. As I mentioned earlier, the mouse is very narrow. When I first got it, I struggled to adapt my bigger hand size comfortably to it, and on stock I didn't feel I can recommend people over 19cm by 9cm to just consider playing with it. Part 2 is the coating. It's very lacking. Very smooth and slippery when my hands got sweaty and just left me annoyed, to be honest. Now, kind of just moving on from the negative nuke that I dropped at the start, I have heaps of good to say though. The MZ1 is the first mouse I've ever felt that the KL 8.0 switch has been implemented insanely well. They sound and feel so crispy, light and snappy. Especially paired with those low profile, deep finger curves wherein your index finger and middle finger just rest so nicely, and to this day it's one of the few mice I still keep the stock switches in, and the only ones overall that I have the KL 8.0s. The overall low shape gives me so much breathing room to play comfortably in the circle of my hand. Recoil control, tracking and flicking felt really good, even if the density of the mouse was still a bit overbearing. Now, the mouse was initially made with Zai and his hand in mind. More specifically the position of his fingers. There are these bald spots on the sides of the mouse where he rests his thumb, ring and pinky finger, without feeling the holes in the shell of course, which is also a silly design choice in my personal opinion. A great touch I want to point out at the base is that the sides are so neatly curved for those who lift their mice and may come down to the pad from a side. It wouldn't cause snagging but rather flow back comfortably into your glides. Now, the last amazing thing I want to point out before getting into all my modifications is the software. It's basically non-existent. You do have the choice to use one, but the mouse does have the ability to use certain actions as a way of changing preset DPI, polling rate up to 1kHz of course, lift off distance, debounce time, and of course the RGB. I feel this is so neat and needs to be utilized way more on the mice we have today. But now we get into the main reason for the video, the modifications. I actually went pretty ballistic on this thing. Besides having a pretty nice paint job on the shell, you can clearly see there's been quite some cutting done to the mouse. I decided to cut in holes on the sides to lose some extra weight, but also give me a comfortable hole to grip my fingers into if I have some recoil to control, or if I just want to play and lock the mouse in as much as possible. Now, flipping mouse over, you can see quite the scene. Once again cutting out extra unnecessary weight. On the top there is a lack of a DPI button, and Pretty much for good reason, as I don't feel the need to swap to anything else and just stick to my choice of 1600 DPI. Now, getting into my favorite part of this whole thing, and that's being the guts of this thing. As you can see, I just pop off the shell with ease because I snipped out the whole section for the screws to lock into. Now, speaking of, there's also a huge lack of screws, which I deemed unnecessary because the mouse build overall is super sturdy. Removing the M1 and M2 clicks. Wow, would you look at that? More holes, more supposed reinforcement, but after removal they don't create any issues whatsoever with my clicks in terms of flexing, creaking and overall inconsistencies. Popping off the top shell, very clearly we can see that DPI PCB is missing. And as I mentioned before, I feel DPI buttons in general are pretty unnecessary. The side buttons and the PCB are still in, as I do utilize them as much as possible in-game and just overall tasks. Next up is the battery. I changed it out from a 500 to a 150, which saves me quite a bit of extra weight. Now on top of that, I also removed the RGB diffuser and the silly adjustable sensor cage along with its screws. Stuck the battery in the middle and made a pretty good center balance focused build. For the most part, it was me just cutting the crap out of the inside structures and base of the mouse. Now, how much did that stack up to? Initially, the weight was 62-ish grams. Now it comes in at a whopping 40-ish grams. That is an insane jump for a mouse that still has the side buttons and PCB in. Now I can fully say that my love for the MZ1 Wireless skyrocketed after getting it this light. Now, the low profile mouse, the grooves and the overall experience gives me such a huge amount of comfort. And pairing that with a very solid 3370 sensor and these AliExpress dots, it's just a buttery smooth time. This video was more just a fun showcase of something I made with inspiration from Butcher Bob himself. Thanks for watching guys, here goes a little montage of me using the Frankenstein mouse over this last week. Take care and a peace. Oh, damn Keegan, freaking swerve, let's go.
Fucking hell, I have 36 kills.
Oh my days.
They got a zone. That's a bad thing.
Enemy shield broken.
Second idea, white. Oh my thing.
It's on roof now?